Hey everyone, let's talk about Chapter 4, Demographics and Social Stratification. I think this is a super interesting chapter, and I wanted to get into just some details about how demographics and different types of demographics really impact consumer behavior, right? So if we continue to orient ourselves around this framework, we are moving through these external influences into demographics and then social status, right? So your book talks about demographics and identifies sort of the main ones as population and size, occupation, education, income, and age. So when we look at demographics in the United States, what we know is that the baby boomer generation, those who are 60-ish and older, even getting into the 50s a little bit, are one of the biggest demographic groups in the country, okay, with millennials being another significant group for marketers. Before I get to that, if you look, for example, in contrast at somewhere like Japan, we see that Japan has an even higher percentage of their population that is older. They have a much, on average, a much older population in Japan. And so there are some concerns there in terms of just replacing the population replacement. And so I say that to get into this idea that with COVID-19, what experts are actually expecting is that something between 300,000 to 500,000, or perhaps even more, fewer babies that will be born in 2021 because of COVID-19. Why is that? What supports this idea? When we look at this idea of the baby bust, so even in the model that estimates 300,000 to 500,000, they didn't incorporate things like continued school closures and continued daycare closures that we're seeing across the country. So they estimate actually that it might even be more than the 500,000 births that would be expected to happen that would not happen. So 500,000 births is, generally speaking, about 13-ish% of the births that we would normally see. So that's a pretty significant change that we are expecting this year. That especially depending on how all these things continue, we might continue to see people delaying or choosing not to have as many children. And so the evidence really comes from not just this modeling, but in addition, several surveys that have been done. One survey indicated that around 34% of American women have either already delayed their plans to have children or reduced the number of children they expect to have as a result of the pandemic. That there's been surveys both in the US and Europe that indicate similar levels. And then another really interesting one, I think, especially in terms of consumer behavior, is actually looking at data on searches for pregnancy-related terms such as clear blue pregnancy tests, ultrasounds, and morning sickness. Those have all fallen since the pandemic began. The authors of that particular study forecasted a reduction of births at about 15%, which is even more than the 13% that was forecasted by this one modeling group. So there's quite a bit of evidence to suggest that there will be a lot fewer babies not born this year, if ever, right? Some of those delays may turn out to be more permanent, and so on and so forth, especially depending on how long the pandemic lasts, which should have a pretty significant impact in the long term on the population. The birth rate in the US is already at least a little bit underneath replacement rates. And so adding an additional strain to that could impact consumer behavior in the long term as well. In your textbook, you have a number of little tables that look similar to this or this. These tables look at different elements of these tables look at a variety of different products, product categories, and then look at different demographics to examine the differences among demographic groups and their purchasing habits, their consumer behavior. So this particular one looks at occupation and splits occupation among three categories: wholesale and resale as one, professional, scientific, and technical as a second, and the third is mining and construction. And then it looks at different products. Okay, so what we see here in all of these different graphs that look like this in your textbook is that these are called indexes. What that means is that 100 is average for the entire population. So when we examine these charts, we can see, for example, if it's a number that's above 100, that particular group is buying more of that particular item than the population as a whole on average. Okay, if it's under 100, then that particular group is buying less than the population as a whole. So for example, in this particular chart, we see that individuals who are in the professional, scientific, and technical fields tend to buy more than average domestic beer. They tend to buy quite a bit less than average in cigarettes, are pretty close to average in diet colas, and a little bit low on satellite radio systems. Okay, significantly higher on sailing than hunting, and so on and so forth. So we can compare them to the overall population. We can also compare them to the other demographic groups. So if we compare each of the different groups, let's say on hunting, for example, what we see is that wholesale and retail trade are right on average. They're just right at 100. Professional, scientific, and technical folks tend to hunt quite a bit less. And then those in mining and construction tend to hunt a lot more than average, okay? So you can look at this and each of these different groups and types of shopping and so on and so forth. And it's pretty interesting to see the differences in consumer behavior when we look at things like occupation, education levels. You know, this one is a little bit older. I didn't find as pretty of a newer one as I had for this. But really what we see is there's not a ton of change between the 2010 study, and I think this is 2016. I looked and there were a lot of differences. So for example, here, if we look at visiting museums, those who graduated college are significantly more likely to visit museums, whereas those who attended but didn't graduate and graduated high school are closer to average. And then those who did not graduate high school are significantly less likely to visit museums. All of these are averages. All of these are, you know, as a whole group, certainly there are people who didn't graduate high school who would go to museums. This does not mean that this is set in stone by any means at all. You know, for example, I was reading about Andrew Carnegie's growing up, and someone who was one of the richest people in our history. And he actually started out as working in I think it was a cotton mill for $1.20 a week. And he didn't graduate high school. He didn't really go to school, but he knew how to read. And so there's someone who allowed what he called working boys to borrow this guy's books. And so he, read this guy's library and attributes that to most of his success, that and hard work. And so he actually funded, when he got older, about 3,000 libraries across the US to help other people in that way, and also funded museums. So I thought that was interesting. Age also has an influence on consumption. So you can see here, looking at a different array of products here. We see that, for example, those who are 65 and older really don't go to places like Victoria's Secret, Chuck E. Cheese's, or the Cheesecake Factory, whereas those who are between 18 and 24 shop a lot more than average at all three of those places. When we look at age groups, we also sort of put this into generations. Okay, so we have the mature market, sometimes also we call the depression and pre-depression individuals, the silent generation. Then we have the baby boomers, Gen X, Gen Y, and Gen Z. So baby boomers are one of the biggest markets in the US. All of them are either retired or very, very close to retirement. So there's a huge market generally for these individuals in terms of products that people are interested when they retire. They're more, but on average, not that this is, again, this is on average, a generalization. On average, baby boomers did have a higher income and higher education than prior generations. They are more tech savvy. Individuals 65 and older are the fastest growing demographic on Facebook. Okay, they are definitely looking at retirement differently. A lot of baby boomers actually are retiring and are so bored that they're getting a second job, a new job, or they're starting their own business in retirement. There's a strong market for things like anti-aging products, travel, of course, financial services, absolutely. And generally speaking, baby boomers are not huge fans of the really strongly youth-oriented ad appeals. Okay. So I like this. This is boomer ad. I know you're only as old as you feel, and I still feel 30. I can text, but I prefer to talk. I'll do a bake sale and hit a few trails too. The grandkids say I'm really cool now, but I don't. What they don't know is I always was. So I like this Jeep ad. I just found a few other tidbits that are and charts that are not included in your textbook from a variety of sources. I think this one is from McKinsey, looking at the 4 major generations here that are consumers in the US. Okay, and so this one you can kind of looks at the context of their youth, what they grew up with, okay, their behavior, and you can see definitely changes here. And then what they can tend to consume, things that are important to them. Of course, millennials, we hear a lot about. Millennials love experiences. They're definitely globalists. They care a lot about them finding themselves. Okay. This one looks at shopping attitudes in terms of the different generations. This one flip-flops, so we have the boomers on the right side now. So you can see here again that sort of like the things that define them in terms of education and social media, kind of what their attitude or sort of like slogan would be, right? Like get it done, or Gen Y is sort of like fun first, then hard work. Gen Z is more fun and frugal, and they kind of attribute that to being younger when the Great Recession hit in 2008 and seeing that hit on the economy. Okay. And then here's one more, looking more at work ethic and values and that kind of thing. So, with millennials, we see that work should be really fulfilling. With the baby boomers, we saw it was more adventurous. Gen X is more like, this is a contract that I need to do. And then the silent generation before that really looked more at work as an obligation. So you can see some real big differences there, which of course changes what your leadership style would be, what your style in terms of interacting with others are as well. So I wanted to spend just another minute on millennials because they are estimated to drive almost half of total US GDP, and spend, of course, billions a year and influence more than $1 trillion a year. Right. One of the biggest things that we know about millennials is that they like to purchase from companies that have a strong meaning or a strong cause. They like to purchase from companies who stand for something. Okay, so that might be Tom's Shoes, for example. This group desires multicultural flavors. Of course, they're attached to their mobile devices, just like the younger generations coming after them as well. And then millennials also really like personalization, and we're seeing that also with some of the younger generations as well. So I'm going to pause right there and end this video with just looking at the occupation and age differences, and we'll come back with the next video and look at social stratification in the United States. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks.